Hey, history fans, let's dive into World War II, a super complicated time. It's tough to know what every soldier thought about their enemies, but we can look at some general ideas that have come up over time. You might already know what the Western Allies thought about the Japanese. But what about the other way around? What did Japanese soldiers think about the Allies, and especially the Americans, since Japan's attack brought the US into the war? Back in the Meiji era, from 1868 to 1912, Japan was changing a lot. They went from being pretty much on their own to becoming more modern and picking up stuff from Western countries. They started playing baseball and watching Hollywood movies, but they also wanted to keep their own Japanese ways. To avoid being taken over by Western countries and to become a big player on the world stage, Japan focused on being united and patriotic. Since Japan didn't have a lot of resources like iron and oil, they thought they needed to expand to other places, which meant going to war. So that's a bit of the background on Japan during that time. It helps us understand why they did what they did and how they might have seen the rest of the world, especially countries like the US. Stay tuned for more cool history insights. All right, history buffs, let's talk about Japan from the mid-1890s to 1945. During this time, Japan was really focused on war. In the 1930s, which was the Showa era, they got super into nationalism, which is like being really proud and sometimes intense about your country. Japan wanted to be seen as a big, powerful country, so they started another fight with China, called the Second Sino-Japanese War. This move didn't go down well with Western countries, especially America. They were not happy about what Japan was doing. As a response, America and others decided to hit Japan where it hurts by stopping trade. They put embargoes on Japan, which means they stopped selling them stuff. This made it really hard for Japan to keep going in the war, because they needed things like oil and other materials they usually got from other countries. So that's a snapshot of what was happening with Japan and how it affected their relationship with countries like America. It's a key piece of the puzzle in understanding the big picture of World War II. Did you know that around 80% of Japan's oil and a lot of its steel came from the US? So when the US stopped selling oil to Japan in mid-1941, it was a huge deal for the Japanese. Many people in Japan felt like they were backed into a corner with nowhere to go. Some of their leaders even thought the US cutting off oil was like starting a fight without throwing the first punch. There's this Japanese military booklet from December 1941 called "Read This Alone and the War Can Be Won." It said that the war was really about whether Japan would keep growing or start going downhill. The booklet compared America's stopping oil and steel sales to Japan to someone slowly choking their enemy with a soft rope. It was like a quiet but powerful move that made things really tough for Japan. This part of history helps us understand why Japan felt so pressured and why they made some of the choices they did. It's all part of the big, complicated story of World War II. Let's talk about a big moment in World War II, December 1941. That's when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. They wanted to weaken the U.S. Navy so they could take over places in the Far East and grab the resources they needed. There's a Japanese military booklet from that time that gives us a peek into how they saw things. The first chapter talks about how countries like England, France, America, the Netherlands, and Portugal came into the Far East. The Japanese saw these countries as just showing up and taking over, scaring the local people who weren't as advanced, and making all these places their colonies. The booklet kind of paints a picture of these Western countries acting like they owned the place and didn't care about the people who were already there. It's interesting to see how the Japanese military viewed the situation and the role they thought Japan should play in the Far East. That Japanese military booklet had more to say. It talked about how Western countries, like the US and European nations, took natural resources from Asian countries. It said that these Westerners, who they called white men, made life really hard for millions of people in Asia. But here's the twist. The booklet painted Japan as the hero of Asia. It suggested that other Asian countries looked up to Japan and hoped Japan would help them become free and happy nations. In this story, Japan saw itself as the only one who could stand up to the West. The West was seen as the bad guy who took over places and didn't care about the people. Japan was trying to show itself as the good guy, the hope for all of Asia. It's interesting to see how Japan told its side of the story during the war. They wanted to be seen as the savior of Asia, fighting against the powerful Western countries. Propaganda is like a tool to spread certain ideas, and Japan had some specific messages they wanted to share. In a graphic by Ikeda Eiji from a 1942 Japanese magazine called Manga, there's an interesting picture. John Dower, who wrote a book called War Without Mercy, talks about this. He says the graphic shows Japan as a kind of rising sun making the world better. This is a nod to Japan's flag, which has a red sun on it. In his book, Dower also mentions that the Japanese often called themselves the top race in the world. They used lots of different ways to talk about this, like special words, pictures, and ideas. They wanted to show that they were better than other countries and had something special that no one else had. This use of propaganda tells us a lot about how Japan saw itself during the war. They wanted to convince people that they were the good guys, bringing light and change to the world. Let's flip the page and see what else was going on in World War II with Japan's propaganda. Jack Wyckoff, a writer, made some interesting points in his review of John Dower's book War Without Mercy. Wyckoff noticed that the Japanese often showed their enemies, like the Western Allies, in a really bad light. They made them out to be all sorts of scary things. Demons, ogres that eat people, bad guys, over-the-top rulers, and even something as silly as dandruff. It was their way of making the enemy seem really awful and scary. A clear example of this is how they depicted American President Roosevelt. They used their propaganda to make him look like a bad guy. It's kind of like in a movie where the villain is made to look really mean and scary. It's important to mention that, unfortunately, sometimes the actions of the Western Allies made these portrayals seem true. This shows how propaganda can both create and reflect the reality of war. Sometimes, the U.S. soldiers didn't treat Japanese soldiers too well, which kind of matched what the Japanese propaganda was saying about them. In his book War Without Mercy, John Dower talks about a memoir by William Manchester, a veteran. Manchester saw a young American soldier use a machine gun on a bunch of Japanese soldiers who had given up and had no weapons. This happened on the Japanese island of Okinawa in 1945. Dower also mentions a historian named Dennis Warner. Warner wrote about a time during the Bougainville campaign from 1943 to 1945 when a U.S. Major General told a colonel to shoot a group of injured, surrendering Japanese soldiers. These stories are just a couple of examples of this kind of behavior. There's more, too. Some American soldiers would take things like ears, teeth, and bones from Japanese soldiers as souvenirs. Historian Niall Ferguson mentioned that it wasn't rare for soldiers to boil the flesh off Japanese skulls. In the book, With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, author Eugene Sledge describes a really shocking moment where a Marine took gold teeth out of a Japanese soldier's mouth while he was still alive. There was this incident where a wounded Japanese soldier couldn't move his arms, and a U.S. Marine tried to take his teeth. When his knife slipped, he cut the soldier's cheeks open. The soldier was in a lot of pain, so another Marine came and ended his suffering. The first Marine just kept on taking what he wanted from the soldier. This kind of brutal stuff was also on the minds of the Japanese soldiers. The U.S. Marines found letters from Japanese soldiers during the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. In the book, I'm Staying with My Boys, by Jerry Cutter and Jim Proser, they mention one of these letters. It said that the Americans on the island were Marines, who the Japanese soldiers thought were picked for their love of fighting. The letter said there was no good way to die if you were captured by them. It talked about prisoners being treated horribly. These stories are hard to hear, but they're part of what happened in World War II. They show us the really dark side of war and how it can make people do terrible things. The Japanese had a few ways to make their soldiers not like the Western ones. One way was to say that Westerners were cowards and didn't have strong beliefs. The Japanese soldiers were taught the Bushido Code, which said that giving up in battle was a sign of weakness. They believed anyone who surrendered, even enemy soldiers, lost their honor. A U.S. Colonel, Fred Borch, explained that the Japanese didn't respect POWs, prisoners of war, at all. They thought POWs had no honor, so when they treated them really badly, like shooting or beheading them. They thought it was okay. A Japanese military booklet called Read This Alone and the War Can Be Won said that Western soldiers were weaker than even the Chinese army. They called them soft and scared of fighting in tough conditions. There was also a Japanese pamphlet mentioned in John Toland's book, The Rising Sun. This pamphlet said Americans only wanted to look brave and were scared of dying. They believed Americans fought without any deeper beliefs or courage. It's hard to say exactly what every single soldier thought about his enemies. What we've been chatting about are just some examples that show what some Japanese soldiers might have thought about Americans and Westerners. A lot of this comes from Japanese military papers and their own propaganda. So, what do you think? Do you believe these views were what most Japanese soldiers thought? Remember, history is full of different stories and viewpoints, and we're just scratching the surface here. Let us know your thoughts as we keep exploring the fascinating and complicated stories of World War II. Stick with us for more interesting bits from the past.